The restaurant in Manhattan glittered like something untouchable, marble floors polished to a mirror shine, chandeliers casting warm gold over white linen tables, waiters moving like quiet choreography. Everything looked expensive, deliberate, controlled. I remember thinking how strange it was that a place designed to feel safe could make me feel so exposed. Ethan had chosen it. Before this story begins, understand something. This is not just about a billionaire and a contract marriage. It's about dignity under pressure, about what happens when a woman refuses to shrink in rooms designed to intimidate her, and about the kind of power that can't be bought. If you believe strength isn't loud, if you believe character matters more than status, and if you're drawn to stories where justice is earned, not handed out, then stay with this one until the end. Subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications, because we don't tell fairy tales here. We tell stories about survival, moral courage, and the quiet choices that change everything. Now, let's begin. He sat across from me in a navy suit that fit too perfectly, smiling in a way that would have impressed anyone watching from a distance. He had opened doors, complimented my dress, ordered wine without asking what I preferred. On paper, he was attentive. In reality, he was editing me. "You'd look more professional if you wore your hair up more often," he said lightly, swirling his glass. Clients take polished women seriously. It sounded like advice. It felt like correction. I laughed it off at first. I had learned to smooth tension with humor. But as the evening unfolded, his tone sharpened. He interrupted when I spoke about my design projects. He corrected my pronunciation of a French wine I hadn't ordered. He joked to the waiter that freelancers had cute little hobbies. Each comment landed softly, but together they built something suffocating. When I checked my phone to respond to a client, his hand covered mine. His smile didn't move, but his eyes hardened. "Can we not do that right now?" he murmured. "It's rude." I slipped my hand free, heat rising behind my ears. I could feel people around us laughing, forks clinking against porcelain, the world continuing like nothing was wrong. That was the worst part. Nothing was technically wrong. Then his hand found my wrist under the table. It wasn't violent. It wasn't dramatic. It was tight enough to remind me that leaving would not be simple. "You're tense," he said quietly. "Relax. You don't need to be so defensive all the time." I looked at him and saw it clearly, the shift. The charm had been a test. The dinner was an audition. I was failing by being myself. Something inside me refused to shrink any further. I excused myself without waiting for permission. My heart pounded so loudly I thought the entire restaurant could hear it. I didn't know where I was going until I saw him. A man sitting alone at the next table. Black suit, silver watch, posture impossibly straight. He wasn't scrolling through his phone or scanning the room. He was simply there, composed, like the noise bent around him. I walked straight to him and sat down. "I'm so sorry," I whispered quickly, leaning closer as if we were mid-conversation. "Can you just pretend you know me?" He didn't look confused. He didn't look amused. His eyes lifted to mine, steady and assessing, as if he had been expecting something unusual all evening. "Of course," he said calmly. "You're late." The response was immediate, seamless. My breath caught. Ethan appeared seconds later, his expression tight with irritation. "What is this?" he demanded, not looking at the stranger but at me, like I was misbehaving. The man beside me stood slowly. He wasn't aggressive. He didn't raise his voice. But when he faced Ethan, the temperature shifted. "She's with me," he said evenly. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Ethan laughed, but it sounded brittle. "We were having dinner. And now you're not?" the stranger replied. There was something in his tone, authority without arrogance, control without threat. Ethan's confidence faltered. He glanced around, aware of eyes turning toward us. His jaw tightened. "This isn't over," he muttered to me. But he left. Just like that. I didn't realize I had holding my breath until the air rushed back into my lungs. My hands trembled slightly against the white tablecloth. "Thank you," I said, my voice barely steady. The stranger studied me, not in a way that felt invasive, but analytical. "You handled that well," he said. I almost laughed. I hid behind you. You removed yourself from a situation that didn't serve you, he corrected. That's not hiding. It was the first time that night someone had reframed my instinct as strength instead of weakness. Up close, I noticed the details. The suit wasn't just tailored, it was custom. A security presence lingered discreetly near the entrance, their attention subtly aligned with him. He carried himself like someone accustomed to boardrooms, not restaurants. I'm Alexander, he said. Amelia. He nodded once, committing it to memory. I assumed that would be the end of it. An awkward rescue. A story I would tell my friends later. But instead of returning to his seat, he remained standing. I'm going to make you an unusual offer, he said. I blinked. That sounds ominous. It's practical. He didn't smile. He explained it without embellishment. He ran a multinational company. There were rumors, instability, shareholders circling. The board wanted reassurance, specifically the optics of a stable marriage. He needed a partner who wasn't chasing his name or his money. Someone who didn't already belong to his world. Someone who could walk up to a stranger and ask for help without calculating the return. I'm proposing a contractual marriage, he said calmly. Temporary, mutually beneficial. Full autonomy. Absolute protection. I stared at him, certain this was some elaborate joke. I don't even know your last name, I said. I did not reply to the email immediately. Instead, I searched his name, Alexander Pierce. The results flooded my screen within seconds: financial journals, interviews, business magazines, photographs of ribbon cuttings, and international summits. Pierce Global Holdings wasn't just structural. It was structural. Infrastructure, renewable energy, urban development, technology acquisitions. The kind of company that didn't just make money, it shaped skylines. I clicked on an older article. Youngest CEO in Pierce history takes the helm after father's sudden death. He had been 34. There was a photo of him standing beside a black, draped podium, jaw set, eyes hollow in a way that only grief can carve into someone. His father's passing had been abrupt, cardiac arrest during a board retreat. No transition plan. No gradual handoff. Just inheritance under pressure. 3 generations built that empire. He had been handed it at its most fragile. Another article detailed his early decisions: debt restructuring, cutting outdated divisions, expanding into emerging markets that older board members considered risky. Analysts had called him disciplined, ruthless in strategy, quietly brilliant. But then the headlines shifted. Engagement to socialite ends amid tabloid controversy. Pierce's personal life raises questions about stability. I felt something tighten in my chest. There were photos of him and a woman draped over his arm at charity galas. Then leaked text messages. Private arguments turned into public entertainment. The narrative pivoted from visionary to unpredictable almost overnight. Investors hate unpredictability. The more I read, the clearer it became. The company's stock had dipped in the months following that scandal. Board members began giving carefully worded interviews about long-term leadership optics. The phrase felt surgical. He hadn't just offered me a contract. He had offered me a shield. My phone buzzed again. A follow-up email from the same encrypted address. Meeting confirmed. Pierce Tower, Humphrey Odors AM. I didn't remember confirming anything. But I went. Pierce Tower rose over Midtown like it owned the sky. Glass and steel, sharp edges reflecting sunlight in calculated brilliance. When I stepped inside, the lobby felt like a cathedral dedicated to power. Polished stone floors, abstract sculptures. Security that assessed without appearing to. I gave my name at reception. They were expecting me. The elevator ride to the executive floor felt like ascending into someone else's reality. My reflection in the mirrored walls looked small but determined. I straightened my shoulders. When the doors opened, Alexander was already waiting outside his office. No entourage. No theatrics. "Thank you for coming," he said. His voice in daylight felt the same as it had in the restaurant, measured, controlled. Inside his office, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked Manhattan. The city stretched endlessly behind him, but he didn't stand in front of it like a conqueror. He stood beside his desk, sleeves rolled once at the wrist, as if preparing for negotiation rather than performance. I assume you've done some research, he said. I have, I replied. You're in trouble. A faint shift in his expression, almost approval. Yes. He didn't sugarcoat it. My father built Pierce Global into a generational institution. I inherited it under scrutiny. I stabilized our debt structure and modernized divisions. That created internal resistance. Resistance, I repeated carefully. A board member named Marcus Holloway has been quietly aligning external hedge funds. If I appear unstable, they can justify a leadership transition. And unstable means unmarried, I asked. It means unpredictable. There was no self-pity in his tone. Just fact. Walked toward the window, hands clasped behind his back. My previous engagement created doubt. The media framed it as emotional volatility. Investors respond to perception more than reality. And the board wants you married. I said slowly. They want permanence. Stability. A narrative they can sell to shareholders. I folded my arms. So I become part of a narrative. You become part of a solution, he corrected. If you choose to. The distinction mattered. He turned back to me. When you approached me last night, you didn't know who I was. You weren't performing. You weren't impressed. You were protecting yourself. You had security, I pointed out. Doubt, yes. You still helped. A pause. That told me more than any background check. I stiffened. You ran a background check? I needed to know you weren't connected to my opposition. There it was, the world he lived in. And, I asked, you're a freelance designer. No public controversies. Modest apartment in Brooklyn. Estranged father. No debt. No lawsuits. No political affiliations. My throat tightened slightly at the word father. You had no right, I said quietly. I needed to ensure you would not be harmed by this arrangement. He replied evenly. And that I would not be. The honesty unsettled me more than manipulation would have. He slid a folder across the desk. 18-month contractual marriage. Financial trust established in your name, independent of me. You retain your career. Separate bedrooms. Confidentiality clauses protecting you from media exploitation. An exit clause at your discretion if I violate terms. I skimmed the document. The numbers alone made my vision blur. This is absurd, I whispered. It is strategic. And what do you get? Time, he said simply. And leverage. There was something almost weary in the admission. And if I say no, then I find another solution. No threat. No desperation. Just calm inevitability. You wouldn't, I said before thinking. His brow lifted slightly. You wouldn't have offered this to just anyone. A silence stretched between us. You're correct, he said finally. The air shifted. Not romantic, not warm, just real. I closed the folder. I need 48 hours, take them. He replied immediately, no persuasion. As I stepped out of Pierce Tower, the city felt louder than before. Bigger, more dangerous. My phone vibrated in my hand. Unknown number. I answered without thinking. Ethan's voice slid through the speaker like oil. You really thought you could disappear, he said softly. You embarrassed me. My stomach dropped. I saw you this morning, he continued. Pierce Tower suits you. Be careful, Amelia. Powerful men don't protect women like you. They replace them. The line went dead. I stood frozen on the sidewalk, skyscrapers towering above me, the contract still heavy in my bag. I had just stepped into a war I didn't understand. And somehow, Ethan already knew exactly where to find me. Pierce, he replied. Alexander Pierce. The name landed heavier than I expected. I had heard it before, financial articles, business headlines. He slid a card across the table. Thick paper. Minimalist. A private number embossed in silver. Think about it, he said. You deserve leverage. And then he left me sitting there. Alone again, but not small. I turned the card over in my hands, my reflection faintly visible in the glossy surface. Hours earlier, I had felt trapped. Now I held something that felt dangerously close to power. The next morning, before I could convince myself the night had been surreal exaggeration, my phone buzzed. An email. Subject line, Pierce Global Holdings, confidential review attached. Inside was a news alert draft schedule for release in 48 hours. The headline read, Pierce Global CEO faces imminent board removal amid scandal. And beneath it, a line that made my stomach drop. Engagement announcement expected to stabilize investor panic. I hadn't said yes. But somehow the world already believed I had. I didn't sleep after Ethan's call. Not because I believed he would show up at my door with a dramatic gesture, but because I understood something worse. He didn't need to. He could damage me without ever touching me again. By midnight, my phone had turned into a small, glowing threat. His messages came in waves, first apologetic, then accusing, then chillingly calm. You made me look stupid. You don't understand who you embarrassed. I can fix this if you stop acting like a child. If you don't answer, I'll assume you want people to know what you're really like. He didn't say what he meant. That was the point. The implication was the weapon. He wanted me filling in the blanks with my worst fears. I sat on the edge of my bed in my Brooklyn apartment, staring at the uneven paint on the wall, the thrifted lamp, the stack of invoices I hadn't sent yet. My life had always been built on fragile independence. Freelance work meant constant uncertainty, late payments, projects that vanished without explanation, clients who smiled while asking for discounts like they were doing me a favor. Rent kept climbing. My savings kept shrinking. Pride didn't pay Con Edison. Alexander's offer wasn't romance. It wasn't rescue. It was protection. Legal protection. Structural protection. The kind of protection Ethan couldn't talk his way around. Still, the thought of signing anything that tied me to a stranger's world made my stomach turn. I opened my laptop and buried myself in research like it could function as armor. Pierce Global Holdings wasn't just a company. It was a machine with multiple moving parts. Government contracts, renewable energy partnerships, infrastructure projects that determined which communities got rebuilt and which got abandoned. I watched Alexander's speeches, expecting polished emptiness. Instead, I found consistency. He spoke about long-term systems, not short-term applause. He talked about public trust like it mattered. He didn't grin for cameras. He didn't perform warmth. He sounded like someone who believed discipline was a form of respect. That didn't make him safe, but it made him predictable. And after Ethan, predictable felt like oxygen. By morning, I had a list written in sharp, black ink on a notepad, my non-negotiables. The list wasn't romantic, it was survival. Separate bedrooms, emotional boundaries, continued freelance work, absolute freedom to leave if deception or coercion appeared. No public humiliation disguised as branding. No ownership over my time, my body, my name. I read the list again before leaving, my hand shaking slightly as I tucked it into my bag. Not from fear of Alexander, from fear of how easily power could make anyone forget what they deserved. Pierce Tower received me like I was expected, again. That part still unsettled me. The elevator rose in silence, and by the time the doors opened, I had rearranged my face into calm. Alexander met me in a private conference room this time, not his office. The room was all glass and steel, with a long table that seemed designed to intimidate. He didn't sit at the head, he sat across from me, leaving space between us like a statement. "You look like you came prepared," he said. "I did," I replied, sliding my list forward. "I'm not negotiable." He picked it up, scanned it, and nodded once. "I agree." Just like that, I blinked, suspicious. "You didn't even hesitate." "Me objective is stability, not control," he said. "If you feel trapped, it fails." The words landed in my chest with an unfamiliar sting. I'd heard men claim they didn't want control. I'd never heard one structure an entire contract around proving it. His attorney joined us briefly, walking through the document with careful clarity. The numbers were still surreal, but what made my throat tighten wasn't the money. It was the trust fund clause. "This ensures Amelia has independent access," the attorney said, "regardless of marriage status." I looked at Alexander. "You're giving me an exit even before I ask for one." He met my gaze evenly. "I don't want you staying because you can't leave." My voice softened without permission. "Why?" His jaw tightened, just slightly. "Because I know what it looks like when someone stays out of fear. It creates resentment. It creates leverage. I'm not interested in either." There was history in the way he said it. Something unresolved, something that had burned him before. We signed. The pen felt heavier than it should have. When my signature dried on the paper, my life split cleanly into before and after. By the end of the week, the announcement hit like a controlled explosion. PRSGLOBLCOLUXINDRPRCEGDTO Rowan. I stared at the headline on my phone, heartbeat stuttering. I hadn't even practiced wearing his last name in my head. Suddenly, the world had decided it belonged to me. The market reacted instantly. Financial analysts praised stability. Commentators framed me as a quiet, grounding presence. No one asked who I was. They just decided what I represented. When I stepped into Alexander's car for the first public appearance, the driver didn't speak. The security detail didn't smile. The windows were tinted, the city blurred beyond them, and I realized how quickly safety could start to resemble isolation. At the first event, a woman in pearls looked me up and down and smiled like she was tasting something sour. "So refreshing," she said, voice syrupy. "Alexander usually dates women who fit the brand." "Where are you from again?" "Brooklyn?" I answered. Her smile held. "No, I mean originally." The room felt suddenly colder. Around us, other guests pretended not to listen. I knew that question. I'd heard versions of it before, polite packaging around the assumption that I didn't belong. "I'm from here," I said evenly. "Same as you." Her eyes flicked, annoyed that I didn't shrink. Later, an etiquette consultant coached me on how to stand, how to laugh, how to angle my face toward cameras. Each instruction felt like another hand trying to reshape me. Alexander noticed. "You don't have to perform for them," he murmured as we stepped aside. "Only what we agreed to." I looked at him, surprised by the quiet firmness in his tone. "They're already performing for me." "They'll get bored," he said. "They always do. The board won't." That word, bored, reminded me why this was happening. Nights in the penthouse were the strangest part. Silence stretched across rooms too expensive to feel warm. Separate bedrooms, like we agreed. No intrusion. No sudden intimacy. Just the awareness of another presence behind a closed door. A man who could have controlled everything and chose not to. Then, one afternoon, Alexander's legal counsel called me directly. "We intercepted an attempt to several outlets," she said. "From Ethan Caldwell." My stomach dropped so hard I tasted metal. "He contacted them." "Yes. He claimed he had insider details about you." "We shut it down." I gripped the phone. "What did he say?" A pause. "He suggested you were unstable." Untrustworthy headline hit before my coffee finished dripping. Rowan to Federal Vuligacy PAERCECOs Anebufa Lenike ta Vanifixe des HMR. My last name looked foreign on the screen, like it belonged to someone else. Like it was being dragged into daylight by strangers who didn't care what it cost. The article wasn't even clever. It was a collage of old court records, a grainy photo of my father being led into a courthouse, and speculative paragraphs designed to make readers feel smarter than me. I scrolled until my hands started shaking. They weren't accusing me of a crime. They were accusing me of being born wrong. The comment section was worse. People didn't argue about facts. They argued about blood, about background, about whether someone like me could ever be safe inside a company like Pierce Global. A few comments dressed it up in politeness, words like class and culture fit. Others were blunt, ugly, and proud of it. They asked where I was really from, even though the story wasn't about ethnicity. They had to add another layer of blame, another reason I didn't belong. It was the same old script. If you can't attack the woman's actions, you attack her identity. My phone lit up with messages from numbers I didn't recognize. Some were curiosity disguised as concern. Some were pure cruelty. One read, "He married down. They always do it and regret it." I turned the phone face down like it could stop the noise. Then I walked through the penthouse and knocked on Alexander's office door with a force I didn't mean to show. He looked up from a screen filled with charts and emails. He'd already seen it. I could tell by the way his jaw set, the way the air in the room felt sharpened. "I didn't tell you," I said, voice tight. "I didn't tell you about him." Alexander didn't flinch. He didn't look betrayed. He didn't look disappointed. He looked focused. "Tell me now," he said quietly. "Everything. Not for damage control. For truth." Something in my chest cracked at that. I'd braced myself for anger, for regret, for the cold calculation that I was now an inconvenience. Instead, he offered space. So I gave him what I'd never given anyone in full. My father's name is Jonathan Rowan, I said, forcing each word out like it weighed a pound. When I was 17, he was arrested for fraudulent investment schemes. He took money from people who trusted him, families, retirees, people who couldn't afford to lose it. I swallowed hard, hearing the old echoes in my head, sirens, whispers, neighbors who suddenly avoided eye contact. When it became public, my life split in half. My mother stopped leaving the house. People at school looked at me like I was contaminated. Teachers treated me like a warning sign. Friends' parents stopped inviting me over. My voice thinned. I learned what shame feels like when it's not even yours. Alexander stayed silent. He didn't interrupt. That made it harder. I moved out as soon as I could. I continued, changed addresses, kept my head down. I built a life that didn't depend on anyone's money or promises. I told myself I'd never be trapped by corrupted power again. His eyes didn't soften into pity. They sharpened into understanding. "Did you have any involvement?" he asked. "No," I said, immediate. I didn't even understand what he was doing until it exploded. Alexander nodded once, like he believed me because he'd listened instead of hunting for a weakness. "Then your father's crimes don't define your integrity," he said. "But the board will pretend they do." That sentence was the real wound. Not that it was true, just that he said it without pretending the world was fair. "What do we do?" I asked, my pride barely holding together. "We don't deny," he said. "We control the narrative with honesty." The word honesty felt dangerous in a world built on optics. But Alexander spoke like a man who'd learned that half-truths rot faster than headlines. Within hours, his communications team arranged a press conference. Tight, controlled, minimal. No open Q&A circus. No room for ambush. I stood behind a podium with bright lights burning into my eyes. Cameras clicked like insects. My throat felt raw before I even spoke. Alexander stood off to the side, not touching me, not performing affection, just present. Steady. I took a breath and looked directly into the lenses, into the place where strangers would later freeze, frame my face, and decide what it meant. "My father committed financial fraud," I said clearly. "He served time. His crimes harmed people. I do not excuse them. I do not defend them." A murmur moved through the room. "I was 17 when it happened," I continued. "I did not participate. I built my life away from that damage. My choices, my work, and my character are mine." I paused, letting the silence settle instead of rushing past it. "I understand why people are afraid of corruption," I said. "I'm afraid of it too. That's why I've spent my adult life trying to be the opposite of what hurt me." For a moment, the room didn't feel hostile. It felt listening. The response online wasn't clean, but it shifted. People shared clips of me speaking without polish. Some said they respected the accountability. Others still screamed about bloodlines and fitting in. The ugliness didn't vanish, but it didn't win the room the way Marcus Holloway probably expected. Marcus. His name started appearing more often in Alexander's calls. I'd hear it from the hallway, tight voices, legal phrasing, controlled anger. "They're pushing for an emergency leadership review," Alexander told me that evening, removing his tie like it was made of wire. "Holloway is pressuring 2 board members to accelerate the vote." "So this was never about me?" I said. "It was about using you," he replied. He underestimated how people respond to truth. I should have felt relieved. Instead, I felt targeted. Because truth didn't stop someone like Marcus. It just forced him to escalate. I stopped being ornamental after that. I sat in briefings. I read internal memos. I studied how the foundation's outreach money moved, how much went to visibility, and how little reached actual streets. My outsider perspective wasn't sentimental, it was efficient. I pointed out waste that insiders had accepted as normal. "This grant program looks generous," I told Alexander one night, tapping a spreadsheet. "But it's designed for headlines, not impact. Redirect it to direct infrastructure partnerships. Let the results speak for themselves." He looked at me for a long moment, then nodded. "Do it." It startled me how quickly he trusted my judgment. Somewhere in that process, the boundaries we built began to blur, not physically, not dramatically, but emotionally. He stopped speaking to me like a contract. He started speaking to me like a partner. And I hated how much steadier I felt because of it. Then Ethan resurfaced. Not directly to me. That would have been too obvious. Too easy to stop. He found my father. A call came from Alexander's legal counsel. We've intercepted communications between Caldwell and Jonathan Rowan at the correctional facility. Caldwell has been pushing for a statement. My stomach dropped into a familiar darkness. A statement about what? I asked, though I already knew. Implying you knew more than you disclosed, she said carefully. That you were aware of your father's schemes. The room tilted. It wasn't enough that my past existed. They needed to rewrite it into guilt. Marcus acquired the statement within days. The timing was surgical, aligned with the final board vote. On the morning of the vote, the boardroom felt like a courtroom disguised as corporate elegance. Polished wood. Water glasses untouched. Men and women in tailored suits acting like the future of thousands of employees was just a line item. Marcus sat across the table, smiling like he'd already won. He stood when it was his turn, voice smooth, regretful in a way that performed morality. I didn't want this to become personal. He said, eyes flicking toward me. But transparency is required. A statement from Jonathan Rowan suggests his daughter was aware of his activities. Gas rippled through the room, quiet, contained, but sharp. My face burned. Not because I was guilty, but because I knew what it felt like to be judged without trial. I stood before anyone could tell me not to. That statement is false. I said, voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. And you know it. Marcus's smile barely shifted. Do I? Alexander rose beside me, his tone calm in a way that made the room listen. We have financial forensics linking Mr. Holloway to coordinated stock manipulation and external hedge fund collusion, he said. We were prepared to present it today. Marcus's eyes narrowed for the first time. Then a security officer entered quietly and handed Alexander a tablet. Alexander's gaze dropped, scanning something, and I saw something flicker across his face, surprise, then calculation. What is it? I whispered. He didn't answer. Instead, he connected the tablet to the boardroom screen. The display went dark for half a second. Then a new file appeared, unlabeled, anonymous, already opening itself like it owned the room. And the first line on the screen read KFENTIAL PIERC Jalaba INTRNAL EVDNCOFTRA son. Every head turned. Every breath stalled. Marcus's smile vanished completely. The anonymous file began to play, revealing a voice recording that could destroy Marcus Holloway, or expose a secret about Pierce Global that even Alexander didn't know existed. The boardroom screen didn't just show a file. It showed a verdict. For a moment, no one spoke. The kind of silence that isn't empty, but packed with calculations. I watched Marcus Holloway's face as the first page loaded, rows of transactions, coded accounts, transfers routed through layered entities with names that looked harmless until you understood how money hides. Alexander's hand hovered near the remote, steady. Mine stayed at my side, but I could feel my pulse in my fingertips. I wasn't afraid of being exposed anymore. I was afraid of what exposure would do to everyone in this room, what desperation would turn them into. Marcus recovered first. He always did. This is a fabrication, he said, voice smooth, but slightly higher than before. A crude attempt to distract from the personal scandal that's already eroding shareholder confidence. His eyes flicked toward me when he said personal scandal, like he wanted to remind the room that my blood was still available as a weapon. I kept my expression still. I refused to become his punctuation. The general counsel leaned forward, scrolling through the document with practiced focus. The forensic accounting team, two people in quiet suits who looked like they belonged in numbers, not drama, began checking timestamps and signatures. One of them spoke without looking up. These transactions align with the stock dips we flagged. Same dates. Same patterns. Marcus laughed once, too fast. You can align anything if you want it to fit. The second accountant finally raised his head. Digital signatures are intact. These aren't screenshots. These are original logs. Something shifted in the room. It wasn't outrage yet. It was recognition. The kind that makes powerful people realize the ground under them has moved. A board member I'd barely heard speak before, an older woman with a silver bob and eyes like winter, turned to Marcus. "Explain the roading through competitor shell accounts," she said. Marcus's mouth opened, then closed. He tried again. "I don't have to dignify. You do," she interrupted, calm and lethal. "Because you insisted on dignifying other people's past today." The hypocrisy landed. A few faces tightened with discomfort. Marcus had enjoyed the moral stage when he believed he was holding the spotlight. Now the light exposed him, and he looked almost offended by it. Alexander didn't gloat. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't press his advantage with cruelty. He simply stood there as the truth did the work. "We initiated internal audits weeks ago," Alexander said. "That we didn't release findings because we didn't want to destabilize the company with speculation. Today, speculation arrived anyway." He looked around the table, not at Marcus. "What happens next is not personal," he continued. "It's structural. The company either protects itself from sabotage or invites more of it." My throat tightened at the word sabotage. Marcus had tried to make my life a distraction, a smokescreen. I realized with cold clarity that the attack on my family history hadn't been about morality. It had been about timing, keeping eyes on me while he moved money in the dark. The vote proceeded with ritual precision. Hands lifted, names recorded. Silence after each decision like a drumbeat. When the final tally was read, the room exhaled in a collective, reluctant release. Alexander retained his position, by a margin small enough to remind everyone how close the cliff edge had been. Marcus's suspension was immediate. Security stepped in, not dramatic, not rough, just firm. The kind of removal that doesn't allow dignity because dignity wasn't offered to anyone else. As Marcus stood, he looked at me again. The expression wasn't rage. It was something colder. "You think you've won," he said quietly, as if speaking only for me to hear. "But people like you don't survive in rooms like this. They tolerate you until they don't." Then he was gone. No one reacted to his parting shot. Not because they didn't hear it, because they were used to that kind of poison being spoken softly. My stomach twisted, not with fear, but with a bitter awareness of how racism and class contempt can exist in polished rooms without ever being called what it is. It wasn't shouted. It was implied. It lived in tone, in assumptions, in who was considered safe. The crisis stabilized within hours. News outlets pivoted fast, hungry for a cleaner story. CEO survives board sabotage, corporate intrigue, market resilience. The stock rebounded so sharply it looked like triumph. But inside me, nothing felt triumphant. It felt like surviving a storm by standing still long enough for it to pass. At the press briefing, I stood beside Alexander the way I always did, composed, controlled, but something had changed. I could feel it in the way we moved. Not staged anymore, not rehearsed. We weren't pretending to be aligned. We were aligned. When the cameras stopped, Alexander didn't touch me, didn't perform gratitude. He waited until we were inside the elevator, alone, the doors sealed. "You didn't flinch," he said quietly. "I wanted to," I admitted. He nodded once, understanding. "Your transparency forced the room to respect you, even when they didn't want to." Back at the penthouse that night, Manhattan glittered below us like a field of expensive lies. Silence filled the rooms again, but it felt different now, less like distance, more like exhausted relief. Alexander poured water into a glass, then set it down untouched. "I owe you," he said. "I didn't do it for you," I replied before thinking. His gaze lifted. Not offended, just curious. I corrected myself, voice quieter. "I mean, I didn't do it for the contract. I did it because I refused to be used." A faint tension eased in his shoulders. "Then we understand each other." He thanked me formally anyway, because that was how he protected people, with structure and acknowledgement rather than sentiment. He told me my press conference had saved credibility when denial would have looked like guilt. I told him his defense in that room had been the first time in years I'd felt someone stand beside me without condition. The distance between us narrowed not physically, but emotionally, like two people who had stopped pretending they didn't matter to each other. Weeks passed, and the company moved forward like it had been waiting for permission to breathe. Pierce Global launched a community infrastructure initiative based on the restructuring I'd suggested. It wasn't charity. It was direct impact, pipes replaced, streets repaired, solar grids installed where the city had forgotten people existed. Employees talked about it with pride instead of obligation. Ethan's noise faded. When powerful lawyers shut doors, men like him find quieter corners. I should have felt satisfied. Instead, I felt unsettled because I knew his kind didn't disappear. They just wait for new openings. My father's name surfaced again in indirect ways, an email forwarded by legal counsel, a letter request, a mention that he wanted to speak. I couldn't bring myself to respond. Healing didn't feel like a decision. It felt like a terrain I didn't know how to cross. Alexander's legal team confirmed Marcus was under criminal investigation. For the first time, I saw something like relief in Alexander's eyes, thin, controlled, but real. And then I noticed something else. He wasn't looking at me like a solution anymore. At staff meetings, I sat in the back, listening, learning the faces and names of people who made the company run. People responded to me differently than they responded to the board. They relaxed. They spoke more honestly. Alexander watched that shift with a kind of quiet astonishment, as if he was seeing a thing he'd forgotten was possible: trust without fear. At a charity fundraiser in Chicago, I saw him with employees' families. He knelt to speak to a little boy in a suit too big for his shoulders, listening like the child mattered. His composure softened around children in a way it never did around executives. The realization unsettled me. Power hadn't hardened him completely, and that made the contract feel less like a wall and more like a door neither of us had admitted we were standing near. When the board suggested extending our optics indefinitely, it didn't sound like a request. It sounded like a quiet trap dressed as strategy. Alexander told me about it later, his tone neutral but his eyes sharp. They want continuity, he said. They're asking if we'll renew the arrangement. My chest tightened. And what do you want? He didn't answer immediately, and that pause felt louder than any confession. That night, we scheduled a private conversation, no lawyers, no assistants, no board. Just the two of us. We were finally going to discuss whether freedom meant ending this marriage or choosing it. But before the conversation could happen, before I could decide what my life was supposed to become, the penthouse intercom buzzed. The security chief's voice came through, that controlled but urgent. Mr. Piercy, there's someone downstairs insisting on speaking to you. Says it's about Marcus Holloway. Says you'll want to hear it tonight. Alexander's eyes narrowed. Who is it? A pause. Then the answer came, and my stomach went cold all over again. It's Jonathan Rowan, the security chief said. Amelia's father. I stared at Alexander, unable to breathe, as the man whose crimes had nearly destroyed my life walked into Pierce Tower demanding to be heard, holding information that could reopen everything we thought we'd buried. The security chief's words didn't feel real until I saw my father in the lobby surveillance feed, older, thinner, wearing a dark coat that hung on him like a borrowed apology. He stood beneath Pierce Tower's polished lights with the posture of someone who knew every eye in the building could judge him in a single glance. I didn't even know he was out. My throat tightened as if my body was trying to protect me from the past by refusing to let it enter. Alexander didn't move toward the elevator right away. He looked at me first, quiet and deliberate. You don't have to see him, he said. The fact that he offered that, without hesitation, without control, made the room tilt, because part of me wanted to run. Another part of me had spent years pretending I didn't want exactly this, a chance to hear him say the words he never said. I don't know what I have to do, I whispered. We'll do it safely, Alexander replied. Controlled. On your terms. In his world, safety came through structure. For the first time, I didn't resent that. I needed it. We took a private elevator down, security clearing the hallways in advance. But by the time we reached the lower floors, it was too late to keep the moment invisible. Someone had already seen him. Someone had already texted someone else. By the next morning, paparazzi photos were everywhere, Jonathan Rowan entering Pierce Tower, grainy and incriminating, like proof that scandal was contagious. Convitia Fodstar PRC Femile Ajin SMLI Ra Hoser Aldars. The headlines didn't ask questions. They made statements that sounded like questions. I stared at the coverage until my eyes burned. The worst comments weren't about my father. They were about me. About pedigree. About whether I was civilized enough for boardrooms. About how people like me always bring chaos into legacy families. They use polite words to frame ugly beliefs. They always did. The racism wasn't shouted. It was implied, tucked into phrases like culture and background and our kind of people. I wanted to throw my phone across the room, but that would have been giving them the satisfaction of imagining me as unstable. Instead, I went downstairs. My father sat in a small conference room, flanked by 2 security officers and Alexander's legal counsel. He looked up when I entered and froze, like he didn't know whether he deserved to breathe the same air as me. "Amelia," he said, voice rough. "I didn't think you'd come. I didn't think you'd show up here." I answered, my tone colder than I meant. Of all places. His eyes flicked to Alexander standing a few feet behind me, silent and watchful. "I'm not here to ruin you," my father said quickly. "I'm here because I owe you, because I made it worse." I crossed my arms. "You made a lot worse," he swallowed, I know. For a moment I hated how small he looked. Because my anger needed him to be bigger. It needed him to be the monster I'd built in my head to make my survival feel clean. "I'm on parole," he said. "Early release. I didn't plan to come to New York first." But then I heard about the statement. My stomach tightened. The one Marcus used. My father nodded, shame carving deeper lines into his face. "That wasn't my idea," he said. "Ethan Caldwell, he contacted me. He pushed me. He made it sound like you'd abandoned me, like you were using powerful people to bury me." I laughed once, sharp. "You didn't need help believing that." His face flinched like I'd slapped him with truth. "You're right," he said. "I didn't. I wanted to believe you still needed me, because if you didn't, then I had to face what I'd done." He reached into his coat slowly, careful, like he knew sudden movements could get him removed. He pulled out a small device, an old phone, cracked at the corner. "I recorded him," he said. "Caldwell. I recorded him pressuring me. I thought if I had proof, maybe it could undo some of the damage." Alexander's attorney took the phone and handed it to a tech specialist. Seconds later, audio played through the speakers. Ethan's voice filled the room, smooth, manipulative, confident. "You sign it, Jonathan, and you get what you want," he said on the recording. "You want your daughter to answer your calls again. You want her to stop pretending she's better than you. This will force her down where she belongs." The words landed in my chest like a stone. Not because they were new, because they were confirmed. The recording continued, Ethan's tone sharpening into cruelty, offering money, threatening exposure. He said my name like it was property. He used language about people like her that made my skin crawl, like my place in the world was something he could assign. When the audio stopped, the room felt airless. Alexander didn't speak. He didn't need to. His silence was a kind of shield. My father stared at the table, voice barely audible. "I'm sorry?" he said. "I let him use me. I let greed destroy my integrity. And I let my shame become your inheritance." My throat tightened unexpectedly. I wanted to stay angry. Anger was easier. Anger had edges I could hold. But then he added something I didn't expect. "You rebuilt yourself?" he said, eyes glossy. "Without me. You did what I never could. You became someone I can't touch with my mistakes." The acknowledgement broke something in me that had been locked for years. Not forgiveness. Not reconciliation. Just the raw, exhausting truth that I'd wanted him to see me. I left the room before my face could betray how close I was to tears. That night, Alexander's team quietly delivered the recording to the proper authorities. Ethan's name started appearing in investigations, harassment, attempted blackmail, coercion. It wasn't public at first. It was procedural. The kind of consequences that arrive without spectacle. Pierce Global took another media hit anyway, but investors didn't panic this time. The board even commended Alexander's crisis containment, as if my life was a fire drill they were grading. A week later, Alexander asked for a private conversation. No lawyers, no assistants, just us in the penthouse, the city humming beneath the windows. The arrangement has served its purpose, he said quietly. The company stabilized. Holloway is under investigation. You're protected. If you want out, you're free. No pressure. No negotiation. The words should have felt like relief. Instead, they made my chest ache. I thought about everything that had changed my financial independence, yes, but also my spine. My voice. The way I no longer apologize for taking up space. I thought about how I'd confronted my father's shadow instead of hiding from it. I thought about how Alexander had stood beside me in rooms that were built to erase people like me. And then Fee rose up, sharp and familiar. Not fear of him. Fear of depending on anything that felt good. I don't want to be trapped, I said, my voice thin. Alexander's eyes didn't harden. They steadied. Then don't trap yourself. Choose or don't. But choose because it's yours. Days passed with tension sitting between us like a third person. We kept our distance. We kept our routines. We pretended we weren't both listening for the moment the truth would finally speak. Then came Colorado. A company retreat at a remote lodge, executives, security, curated calm meant to signal unity. The first night, snow began falling with quiet persistence. By morning, it had become a blizzard that swallowed roads and erased the outside world. Power lines went down by evening. The lodge turned dim, lit by emergency lanterns. People who were usually loud with status became quiet with fear. I watched Alexander move through the building, not as a billionaire, not as a brand, but as a leader. He checked on staff. He redistributed blankets. He instructed security to escort older attendees to warmer rooms. He sat with the kitchen staff, listening to what they needed. No cameras, no performance, just effort. I realized then that control looks like Ethan, tight, possessive, humiliating. That protection looked like this, steady, practical, exhausting in the isolation of the storm. My understanding of partnership shifted. Not romance, not fantasy, something sturdier. When the snow finally cleared and the helicopters arrived to escort us out, I already knew what I was going to do. The contract expiration date was the next morning. Back in New York, I barely slept. My answer sat in my chest like a sealed envelope. At sunrise, I stood outside Alexander's office door with the signed documents in my hand, either an exit or a renewal. Inside, I could hear his voice on a call, low and tense. One phrase slipped through the crack in the door and stopped my breath cold. "Jonathan Rowan is missing," Alexander said. And he left a message. He said if anything happens to him, the proof is already scheduled to go public. My hand froze on the door handle as I realized my father hadn't to New York only for redemption. He had come with a secret big enough to risk his life. And my decision about the contract might now decide whether we survived what he uncovered. The contract expired on a morning that looked deceptively ordinary. No press outside the building. No alerts screaming across financial networks. No staged smiles for cameras. Just a pale wash of winter light across the penthouse windows and a legal folder on my hands that felt heavier than it should have. I stood in the hallway outside Alexander's office, frozen by what I'd overheard the night before. Jonathan Rowan is missing. My father. Gone again. Except this time, it wasn't abandonment. It was risk. It was a warning. I pushed the door open anyway. Alexander was on the phone, voice low, controlled. When he saw me, he ended the call with a clipped goodbye, then rose slowly as if he didn't want sudden motion to startle me. "You heard," he said. I nodded, throat too tight for words. He didn't rush into explanations. He walked to the window and stared at the skyline as if the city might offer an answer. He looked like a man holding two disasters at once, one public, one private, and refusing to let either show on his face. "We don't know where he is," Alexander said. "I've left the rehabilitation intake yesterday and didn't arrive at the facility." His parole officer didn't hear from him. Security can't locate his phone. And the message, I asked, forcing my voice into steadiness. Alexander exhaled slowly. He told my security chief that Marcus Holloway wasn't acting alone, that there's evidence connecting Holloway to someone inside Pierce Global's legacy accounts. He said if something happens to him, the proof is scheduled to go public. The room tilted. My father's voice, his choices, had found a way to destabilize my life even when he was trying to make amends. So either he's lying. I said he's scared. Alexander's gaze met mine. He's scared. That certainty made my stomach drop. Alexander didn't speak in guesses. He spoke in conclusions. I looked down at the folder in my hands, the contract documents, the renewal paperwork, the exit clause that could restore my old life, my small, controlled life. And suddenly it felt like I was holding the wrong kind of decision. Like life had rearranged the stakes while I wasn't looking. Alexander gestured to the chairs by the desk. Sit. I sat, still gripping the folder. He didn't take the opposite chair like a negotiator. He leaned against the edge of the desk, hands relaxed at his sides, leaving the room open. This morning is supposed to be about your choice, he said. But I won't let what's happening with your father corner you. The word corner hit a nerve. Every version of control I'd survived had started with someone insisting my choices weren't really mine. I don't know what I'm choosing anymore, I admitted. Alexander's voice softened just enough to feel human. Then we simplify. The company will handle the investigation. My security team will search for your father. None of that changes the truth. You owe me nothing. The board. The board isn't your jailer, he cut in, not harshly, just firmly. And I'm not either. He walked to the desk, opened a drawer, and pulled out a different set of documents, thin, precise. He placed them in front of me. I've already signed the termination of all contractual obligations, he said, effective immediately. Even if you decide to stay, it won't be because paperwork binds you. My fingers hovered over the pages. My eyes scanned the lines that stripped away the clauses that once defined our arrangement. No requirements, no timeline, no obligation to perform stability. It was terrifying, because it meant if I stayed, I couldn't blame the contract. I looked up at him. Why would you do that? His gaze didn't waver. Because if you stay, I want it to be chosen, not owed, not traded. My throat tightened unexpectedly. In my life, the men had always offered things with hooks attached, attention with conditions, kindness with control, safety with ownership. This was different. This was someone handing me freedom, even though it made him vulnerable. I sat back, the air in my lungs feeling sharper. Okay, I said quietly. Then I'm going to say what I need. Alexander nodded once. Say it. I forced myself to speak like my dignity depended on it, because it did. Emotional honesty, I said, not performance. Not silence when things get hard. He listened without interruption. Professional independence. I continued. I will not become an accessory. I will keep working. I will keep building what I've started with the foundation. You will, he said immediately. Shared decision-making, I added. No more decisions about my life made in rooms I'm not invited into. You'll be invited, he said. And this time there was something sharper behind the promise, like he was making it a policy, not a sentiment. And no image-driven manipulation. I finished. Not from your board. Not from anyone who thinks they can shape me into something palatable. Alexander's expression tightened slightly, like the word palatable reminded him of how many people had tried to box him too. Agreed, he said. I stared at him for a long moment, letting the silence become my proof. He wasn't bargaining. He wasn't negotiating. He wasn't trying to win. He was accepting, and that's when the unexpected twist arrived, not from him, but from inside me. I realized the fear that had been guiding me wasn't fear of Alexander. It was fear of myself in something stable, because stability meant I'd have to stop living like survival was my only identity. I slid my original contract folder across the desk. I then placed my hand over it. I'm not renewing this, I said. Alexander's face went still, not anger, not disappointment, just a breath held too long. I continued, voice steady now. I'm ending it. His eyes searched mine, bracing for departure. And replacing it, I added, heart-pounding, with something that isn't a shield. His shoulders lowered, almost imperceptibly. Amelia, no spectacle, I said quickly, not letting emotion turn into weakness. No headlines. No stage ceremony. If we do this, it's because we want to, not because the market needs it. Alexander's gaze softened. A civil renewal, he said, as if naming it made it real. I nodded. Simple. Quail, he added, voice low. The word wrapped around the room like warmth. That afternoon, we walked into a courthouse with minimal security and no photographers. No flowers. No grand staircase. Just papers and signatures and a judge who didn't care about markets. When it was done, nothing outside changed. The city still moved. The world still spun. But inside me, something had shifted, something fundamental. For the first time, I wasn't choosing out of fear. I was choosing out of clarity. In the months that followed, the board didn't resist the decision the way I expected. The stability narrative helped them. Investors liked continuity. Public reaction stayed positive. But I stopped caring about that as my main justification. I expanded my work through the Pierce Foundation, redirecting grants toward direct infrastructure in underserved communities, projects that repaired roads, restored clean water access, modernized school facilities. I kept my language consistent: dignity over charity. Alexander backed executive compensation reforms and transparency policies that made senior leadership uncomfortable. People whispered, but the culture began to shift in small, measurable ways. Ethan faced sentencing quietly. The consequences weren't cinematic. They were procedural, which felt more fitting. Accountability instead of drama. My father relocated out of state under strict monitoring, maintaining distance the way he should have years ago. I didn't forgive him in a single moment. I didn't pretend closure was instant. But I stopped letting his shadow define my choices. One night on the penthouse balcony, the city below looked less like a threat and more like a landscape I could move through on my own terms. I thought about the restaurant, about the way I had clung to a stranger's presence like a lifeline. I understood something I hadn't been able to name before. Hiding behind him hadn't been weakness. It had been my first act of agency. Alexander stepped beside me, not crowding me, not claiming the space, just sharing it. We still haven't found your father's evidence, he said quietly. I know, I replied. And then another layer of reality arrived, one that threatened to reshape everything again. Pierce Global prepared for an international expansion. Europe, long-term infrastructure contracts, political scrutiny, and a suggestion from the board that Alexander should relocate overseas for 2 years to secure investor confidence. The proposal wasn't framed as pressure, but I could hear the old undertone in it anyway: follow power or risk becoming inconvenient. Alexander looked at me, calm but watchful. We'll decide together. Together. The word should have comforted me. Instead, it sharpened the question forming inside my chest. Because if love required following him into someone else's arena, was that partnership, or was that the beginning of losing myself again? As the board's relocation plan landed on Alexander's desk, with a deadline attached, I realized my next decision wouldn't be about marriage. It would be about whether power would move us, or whether we were strong enough to move power. The relocation proposal arrived dressed like opportunity, but it read like a quiet ultimatum. 2 years in London, strategic necessity, investor confidence, European infrastructure markets. The language was polished, as if the decision were inevitable because it had been formatted professionally. I sat in Alexander's office with the document open between us, staring at the words that threatened to undo everything we'd built in New York. Not our marriage on paper, but the life we'd finally begun to shape with intention. Relocation wasn't just distance. It was displacement. It meant stepping away from the community projects we'd pushed into motion, the neighborhoods that had finally begun seeing real repairs instead of ceremonial donations. It meant leaving the support systems I'd built quietly, people who knew me before the headlines, the small routines that reminded me I was still myself. And it meant surrendering 2 years to the kind of social ecosystem that had already tried to shrink me into something appropriate. I didn't say that last part out loud at first. Alexander watched me read, then set his pen down like he was refusing to make any move that could feel like pressure. "We can make it flexible," he said. "Remote leadership adjustments. Hybrid model. I can be there part-time." "The board doesn't want part-time," I replied, tapping the page. "They want you physically present. For optics." Alexander's mouth tightened. "They'll say it's for investors." "And it is," I said. "But it's also for them. Control looks like strategy when it wears a suit." He didn't argue. That was the difference between him and every man who'd ever claimed to listen. Alexander actually took in the words, even when they complicated his life. Still, I could feel the weight of the machine moving behind this request. The board, the advisors, the analysts who didn't see humans, only outcomes. They were already imagining me in London, trailing behind Alexander like an accessory in a better postcode. The next day confirmed it. A finance segment ran a story about the expansion, and the anchor smiled while saying my name like it was a novelty item. "Pierce's wife, Amelia Rowan, may need to adjust," she said. "The European market has a refined culture. It'll be interesting to see if she can adapt." Refined culture. The phrase landed like a soft slap. Online comments didn't bother with subtlety. They called me a Brooklyn experiment. They joked about whether I knew which fork to use. They suggested Alexander should find someone who matches the brand overseas. Some of it drifted into racist insinuations that didn't even try to hide, people assigning me an origin that fit their prejudice, using it as proof I didn't belong in boardrooms, in London, in any room with generational wealth. It was emotional damage with a clean smile. I showed Alexander the clip. He didn't flinch, but something sharpened in his eyes. "They're not evaluating you," he said. "They're policing the boundaries of their world." "And they'll keep doing it?" I replied. "If we relocate, it becomes a spectacle. If we don't, they'll say you're weak." Alexander leaned back, silent for a moment. "So, what's the third option?" That question was the first real sign that he wasn't looking for permission to choose his path. He was looking for a way to choose it with me. I took a breath and opened my notebook, pages of scribbles I'd been making since the proposal arrived, because fear always made me plan. "Dual headquarters," I said. "New York stays the operational center for domestic projects and foundation work. London becomes a satellite headquarters with delegated executive leadership. Decentralized model. You rotate strategically, but you don't uproot the entire company's identity to satisfy investors who confuse presence with competence." Alexander's gaze narrowed, not in skepticism, but concentration. "They'll argue it slows growth." "Let them," I said. "Growth that requires abandonment is just a different kind of corruption." The words surprised me as they left my mouth. They sounded like something I believed too deeply to pretend I was indifferent. We brought the proposal to the board. They resisted exactly the way I expected, polite condescension wrapped in concern. A senior advisor cleared his throat and smiled at me like I was a wanting volunteer. "Mrs. Pierce," he said, "a decentralized model is ambitious. Investors like certainty. They like tradition. Tradition." Another polished word. Another boundary disguised as wisdom. And tradition, I replied evenly, is often just a decision made a long time ago by people who didn't have to live with the consequences. The room went quiet. A board member, one who had never hidden his disdain, tilted his head. "This company cannot be guided by sentiment," he said. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't perform anger. I just met his gaze. "This isn't sentiment," I said. "It's risk management. Centralizing power in one location makes the company more vulnerable. Decentralizing leadership increases resilience. That's not emotional. That's structural." The man blinked, irritated that I spoke his language. Alexander spoke next, calm and decisive. "We're adopting the dual headquarters plan." A pause. Then murmurs. Then resistance disguised as questions. But Alexander didn't fold. And for the first time, I watched the board realize something they hadn't accounted for. He wasn't alone in the room anymore. Not theatrically, not as a wife prop, but as a partner with a strategy they couldn't dismiss without exposing their own bias. Investors reacted cautiously at first. Analysts debated it. Some called it risky. Some called it progressive. Then the numbers held steady. London contracts moved forward without the disruption of uprooting New York operations. Stability didn't collapse. Instead, it expanded. That's when the narrative began to change, not overnight, not cleanly, but steadily. Media outlets stopped calling us a billionaire power couple and started labeling Pierce Global as a reform-driven institution. People wrote about the foundation's impact in neighborhoods that had been ignored. They reported on transparency policies and executive compensation reforms. They wrote about the company like it had a spine. The work didn't erase prejudice, but it made prejudice look small. And that mattered. I led the international community partnership programs, aligned with the European contracts, requiring local hiring commitments, training pipelines, and direct reinvestment into underserved areas. It wasn't charity theater. It was moral architecture built into the deal. There was pushback, of course. There were always whispers that I was overreaching. There were comments about me being too activist. For corporate leadership, the coded language of dismissal never fully disappeared. But now it had to compete with results. Months into the new model, I received a letter with no return address from out of state. Jonathan Rowan's handwriting. The letter wasn't long. It didn't ask for forgiveness. It didn't demand a response. It thanked me for not letting his failures become my identity. It told me he was staying in rehabilitation, keeping distance because that was the only way he could respect me now. It ended with a line that made my throat tighten. You built a life I couldn't buy or steal. I hope you protect it. I folded the letter and placed it in a drawer without ceremony. Closure didn't need an audience. Ethan's case concluded quietly. His name faded from relevance the way small men always fade when their leverage dies. No dramatic revenge, just accountability. Paperwork. Sentencing. The world moving on. A year after the contract anniversary, the night that had once been nothing but survival, Alexander and I hosted a gathering. Not a gala. Not a donor spectacle. A modest event for employees and their families inside one of the community centers the foundation had helped rebuild. Kids ran between chairs. Staff members laughed without checking who was watching. The room smelled like coffee and fresh paint, not perfume and power. Standing there, I looked at Alexander and realized the truth had been hiding in plain sight all along. Wealth did not rescue me. Choice did. Dignity rebuilt me. Partnership amplified my strength. Later, back in the penthouse, the city lights didn't feel like a threat. They felt like proof that the world could be navigated without surrendering the self. Alexander stood beside me, quiet in the way he always was when he meant something deeply. The company survived because integrity replaced ego, he said. And because you let it, I replied. You could have chosen the easiest optics. You didn't. He looked at me for a long moment. You didn't let them turn you into a story they could own. We created a scholarship fund soon after. Support for children of incarcerated parents, built with a kind of tenderness I hadn't expected from either of us. It became the foundation's most celebrated program, not because it was flashy, but because it was honest. It broke cycles quietly, the way real change always does. And in the quiet of our home, no longer defined by clauses and timelines, we existed without performance. The fake marriage that began as a shield had become a foundation. The billionaire who needed stability discovered something wealth never guaranteed, trust that wasn't purchased. The woman who hid for safety became an architect of peace. Sometimes, when I think to that restaurant, I don't feel shame anymore. I don't associate strangers with danger. I associate courage with stepping forward, messy, imperfect human. And somewhere in another crowded restaurant, another woman is sitting at a table where her dignity is being edited in real time. She's calculating exits. She's pretending not to notice the way control hides behind charm. Somewhere nearby, a stranger sits alone, and he doesn't know he's about to be tested. Because sometimes freedom begins exactly where it started for me, in the moment someone decides not to stay seated. And if that woman stands up tonight, if she chooses herself in a room built to shrink her, The next chapter of her life might already be waiting at the nearest table, quiet, unexpected, and powerful enough to change everything.